truly honored to be moderating the session today on agroecology and its role in food sovereignty and nutrition. We'll be talking about different aspects, the intersection of agroecology with communities, with social organizing, with public health, in the environment, public policies, and so on. And we have a very distinguished set, do we say that, of panelists today. My name is Bana Salameh. I'm a research coordinator at the Canada Research Chair in Nutrition and Health Inequalities with Malik Batal. And today we have with us Myriam Paredes. Myriam is a professor and researcher at the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences, so FLACSO in Ecuador. And her research draws a lot on responsible food consumption and alternative food networks, and we'll be hearing much more about the different angles that she tackles. We also have Vivian Valencia, who holds the research chair in sustainable agriculture and climate action at Bishop's University. Vivian focuses on identifying and analyzing exceptional examples that offer groundbreaking alternatives to food and farming systems. We also have Anna Deaconu, who's a postdoctoral researcher at McGill University's Geography Department. She works a lot on supporting equitable and resilient food systems using a participatory action research approach and mixed methods to explore links between agriculture, nutrition, and health. So without further ado, I'd like to start our discussion with Myriam. Myriam, you have done a lot of extensive research on agroecology and alternative food systems from both. You started off with the consumer perspective, and then you also dive deeper into the whole food system and to include also the rural producers. So maybe before we begin, you could tell us I know this is very broad, but what agroecology means for maybe people who are hearing this for the first time or have heard of it but don't know what it really means. Agroecology, food sovereignty, these are very broad. And if you can tell us a bit more about what agroecology looks like in the Ecuadorian context, and what is the role of agroecology in terms of supporting better food systems, whether it's for the consumers or the producers?
Thank you. That's a very long question. So I will go by parts. First, I will talk a little bit about what I call agroecology, not we, but I personally call agroecology. Mainly, agroecology is a combination of ancient practices of food production with more contemporary practices that respect the ecology and the relationships between people and all the materiality that has to do with the food production, such as soils, seeds, plants, animals, etc. But it has become something else, little by little. So I will answer by explaining you with an example from Ecuador of Maria, one of the women who practice agroecology. She is a mother of a teenager and 2 children under 5. She has 400 square meters, which is a lot compared to many other women in her community. She is producing vegetables, and she also produces some fruits. And one of her objectives is to buy each time less food outside the farm. She said that she would like to have lots of fruits because she heard that fruits in Ecuador in particular are produced with lots of pesticides, agrotoxics in general. And for Maria herself, it's very difficult to be an agroecological farmer because her sisters and brothers are producing flowers for export in greenhouses with lots of pesticides, which usually will contaminate her water, the water that she uses for irrigation. She goes to 3 markets. Goes to one market in Quito, the capital city, that is at 1 hour from her town. She goes to another market in her town, in the urban area, and she also goes to a market in her community that started during the COVID period, because during the COVID period, the other markets were closed. So that was the only way she had to sell her produce. She also belongs to an organization of women, 16 women, who go to sell together now in these newly opened markets in the town and also in Quito. She the day before she has to sell the produce, she will be working, packing, cleaning, and preparing everything until 12 at night. And the next morning she will wake up at 2 because she has to get a bus with all these produce. And when she goes to the market, there is not such market. There is a space in the corner of a park where there is no current water, there is no toilet, but women have to bring themselves their tents to set the feria. So they will put the tents themselves, and they will put also very nice clothes over some small plastic tables to sell their produce. And there are specific people that come every time the market opens. So these women, they are mostly women. And there is a specific group of women that are coming to this market because in one of those particular markets, there is also a university where women who are promoting breastfeeding, they get together to support each other, and they decided to be also clients of this market. So by this, I mean that agroecology has become also a network of people who are looking for another way of eating, or another way of producing, another way of marketing, also of food. And in general, agroecology means producing without agrotoxics that are sometimes industrial, but also artisanal agrotoxics, because we can also produce artisanal agrotoxics. And the more horizontal relationship between species, where human beings do not believe are the maximum or the top species, but we are interrelated in the same way with plants, seeds, and the soil biome, our own biome. So it is the idea is getting close to this One Health, but it has certain things that are preventing it to become a One Health idea around food production. Yet agroecology has this way of practice. That's how many women in Ecuador will be practicing agroecology. And for them, it's not just producing food, but it means also going to these markets, networking with other women from the cities, eating in specific ways. And I will let you know later. I know you are doing another question. What are the limitations they are finding? But now this is what agroecology means. What food sovereignty means? Food sovereignty stems from the problems related to the policies of food security. food security in the world, in the global level, tend to propose that food security means people eating enough calories. Yeah? So the food sovereignty idea came from producers' organizations that parallel one of the meetings in the FAO about food security. And they say we didn't have any benefits of the policies of food security. We think we can produce with dignity. We don't want food that is given as a gift. We can produce and decide how better to produce. If we want to produce agroecologically, we want to produce like that. We don't want just receive food as a gift from other places, because for us, food also means culture. It also means identity. And we are waiting more for food sovereignty, which means autonomy and dignity in how food is produced, how food is distributed and consumed. So it's the right of the people to decide how they want to do all these parts of the production and consumption practices. So that's about food sovereignty. And there are lots of conceptualizations that you can find in different web pages of the La Via Campesina, that was one of the main organizations that popularized this concept. So, but later on, it became also policy. So there are many different countries that have food sovereignty policies that replace, at least in the paper, the food security policies, which is really interesting to see, because it means changing the thinking about how all these networks of production and consumption can work in a different way that people design themselves how it can be. Yeah. So that I don't know if I answered the question how it works in Ecuador.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so much. So I will move on to Anna, who also has done a lot of research in Ecuador. And I mean, as we also know, agroecology, as Myriam said, is a lot about not using the agrochemicals, the synthetic pesticides, fertilizers, etc. But there's also an important social dimension. So I would like to ask Anna, since you've done a lot of research on the different pathways that link agroecology to better health outcomes, if you can tell us more about those pathways.
Yeah, so it's interesting because in Myriam's story about, was it Maria, the farmer? And what we see is that agroecology is it's both the agricultural practices, but it's also the social environment. And so I really want to focus on those two as pathways that have a lot of potential to support farmer health. In Ecuador, we've mostly been examining how it can support farmer health in terms of nutrition, though now we're also working with our colleagues in the Utzcaslemal project in Guatemala, where we've added a more integrated approach to health, where we're also looking systematically at pesticide exposure and water sanitation and hygiene and the home environment and some other elements. But if we focus, I think we can focus on nutrition, because I think it really illustrates how there is this nice potential pathway between agroecology, which started as really an agricultural strategy, with farmers' nutrition-related health. What we see here is, if you look first at the actual agricultural strategy, a large part of agroecology, it's all about these synergies. It's treating agriculture as an ecosystem. So what you're doing is you're creating resilience, right? Or that's what you're aiming for. And so when we're talking about populations that face food insecurity, well, if you have, maybe just one or two products or varieties, and then a drought comes in or some pest comes in, you can very easily lose, your economic livelihood, a source of food. But if you're working in an agroecological system, most cases, you're not going to lose everything at once. So you can really support your food security, both in terms of, your economic potential to purchase food, but also your potential to eat your own food. And so then there's another really important aspect there is if you grow diversity, well, you can also eat your diversity. It's a pretty simple logic, right? Always remembering, of course, that the role of diversity on the farm isn't exclusively to eat it. It serves a lot of purposes in terms of, the agricultural ecosystem, the soil health, pest management, etc. So you see this, fairly clear agronomic pathway. And remembering here, if you have a greater diversity of foods that you can eat, well, in nutrition, you also have then a greater diversity of nutrients that are entering your body. And here's where we need to remember also the importance of animals on the farm. Agroecological farms, they integrate animals, maybe not at huge scales, but in a family farm, it's common to have your chickens, maybe your guinea pigs in the Andes, maybe a cow or, some other farm animals. And these, in terms of managing soil fertility, are really important in terms of contributors to soil fertility. But, we're talking about contexts where people still have a lot of micronutrient insufficiency and a lot of protein insufficiency. This is less common, maybe like in our room here. Like I know there are a lot of vegetarians, a lot of vegans for very good reasons in our food environment. But when you're talking about people who are living in an area where they still have these protein insufficiencies and micronutrient insufficiencies, having animals on the farm is a really important way that you can get animal source protein, right? And so the more you can consume from your own production, the less you have to go buy foods. Now, why is that important? I've heard a lot of people argue that it's more important to get people get more income for farmers so that they can go and buy food. That's great if everyone is going and buying the most nutritious foods, but often the income that they're receiving is really not sufficient to be getting this like wonderfully balanced diet. What you're doing is you're buying cheap calories, which are instead going to contribute to overweight and obesity and diet-related chronic disease, right? And so here we have this potential pathway from agroecology through diversity, through own consumption, to this potential to both have better nutrient sufficiency and also better balance if you are not relying so much on these cheap calories. So that's the one pathway, is the agronomic pathway. And then the other one I wanted to discuss is the social pathway. What we see here in the case of the farmer like Maria, who's going to all of these markets and who's interacting with her colleagues at these markets and who's interacting with consumers and who's interacting with these like NGO workshops and spaces and going to meetings like ours. And with a lot of farmers there too. I think we don't have quite so many farmers here today. What you see is you've got this construction of norms. And one story that I really like is about a farmer's market that I was attending in Ecuador, where this woman had actually received, through her child, she had received this like energy bar that was part of the school food program somehow. And she was saying, I have this energy bar and I'm kind of hungry, but I'm embarrassed to take it out because this is from the industry. This is a processed food or an ultra processed food. And so you have this creation of norms that actually people are more conscious of what they're eating. And this is valuable because this is a culture where if there's a wedding, you're going to bring out Coca-Cola because that's a prestige product. But within these agroecological networks, Coca-Cola is not a prestige product, right? And so you've got this tremendous social potential to share knowledge, to create new knowledge, and to create these social norms around healthy eating. Mm-hmm. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much, Anna. So this actually leads us very well into our next question, discussion actually. So speaking of school food programs, Brazil has pioneered a lot of the public health policies that have to do with nutrition. But what was interesting about Brazil is that it pioneered how to take the whole food system into account. And I would like to talk to this about this to Vivian. So Vivian, you have done extensive research on how public policies can support diversified farming systems. And you have researched the Brazilian National School Food Program very well. So I would like to hear from you how such policies can help on the level of the food system, and also how can markets be restructured to support agroecology and diversified food systems.
Yes, thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation to be here. So yeah, the case that I want to share with you, I think, brings everyone who's in the room, because on one side, we care about production, we care about agroecological farming, and we want that because we know it's good for the environment, everything that it's been said. We also care about the consumption side and dietary quality and diversified diets, but those things just don't happen. And for example, from the production side, farmers just don't decide in a vacuum to be an agroecological farmer. There are many factors that come in: traditional knowledge, culture, and so on, but also markets. So markets create a demand, a signal. So what is the market going to buy? And if the market is for commodities and soybean and corn, and there are not strong markets for diversified products, then those agroecological farmers are going to struggle. If your main outlet is then a farmer's market, and then it rained and you didn't sell your things, or selling to a restaurant, that is vulnerable, right? So what the markets are in place will enable or not agroecological farming. And again, it's not the only factor, but it's a very important one. And on the other side, it also structures the food environment of what's available, what people have as options to eat. So then I took a market perspective. So I was interested on how can we restructure markets so that they favor small scale agroecological farmers and so on, but also support a higher diversity of products that are local, fresh, available, accessible, and so on. So this took me to Brazil. Because what is also interesting is that it's not only the private sector that can create markets that have such a large influence. The public sector can also create markets that are very meaningful. And that is what this Brazilian case shows. So basically, with Lula's first term, a program that you may know already, Zero Hunger, was created. And under this program, their public food procurement policies were redesigned. So their school lunch program, all those things have existed since the 50s and so on. But with Lula, these programs were redesigned to have a focus also on small-scale farmers. So what's very innovative is that it linked a nutrition program with rural development and small-scale farmers, so that 30% of the budget, the purchasing budget, had to be devoted to purchases from small-scale farmers, women's groups, indigenous groups, so positive discrimination towards these groups. I also have to add that it just didn't happen because Lula showed up to power, but it's also the result of decades of social movements work. El Movimiento de Mulheres Campesinas, the landless farmers, workers movement, and so on. So years of social movement, along with political leadership, allow for the redesign of these programs. And I studied this in the south of Brazil, and what I found was an extraordinary case, because in this area, the typical markets were commodity markets, so soy, corn, either for the regional or international markets, mostly to feed cattle. And there were small-scale farmers also growing vegetables, so horticulture, a lot for their own consumption, and also to sell, but to smaller markets, right? So a farmer's market, once, twice a week, restaurants, but these were very small channels, marketing channels, which meant that their productions were small and that the economic contribution of those markets were also very small. It was basically pocket money for some of the women, because it was also the women who were leading the cultivation of this vegetable gardens and so on. The men were in charge of the grains or the more commodified production. But when this program appeared, they had the opportunity to redesign their farms and say, hey, there is a large predictable demand, so we call structured demand, that can enable us to rely on these markets, because the farmers market one day, yes, no, but this is a reliable market. You know how much they're demanding, where to take it. There's no surprises. You know the prices, because it's also one of the principles is price stabilization. So many of the households, also the women played a big role here in persuading those changes, were able to leave the commodity market and commodity farming and become vegetable producers, so switch to more diversified products that were feeding people. And again, because this was linked to the school lunch program, and this is at a municipality level, this created a more localized market. And yeah, the bulk of it was going to the schools, but the surplus was going to the community. So why is this important? Because all governments purchase food. When you look at it from a GDP perspective, like between 3 and 30% of a government's GDP go into the purchase of food, goods and services, and a large percentage is the purchase of food, not only for schools, but hospitals, prisons, and a lot of public spaces. So if more governments realign their food purchasing criteria with this type of criteria, like, okay, let's focus a percentage of our budget to our local farmers, let's give them a premium if it's agroecological and so on, it can really transform food systems, and it can really shift what farmers are doing, so that you can be an agroecological farmer and have a stable market and that's reliable and so on. And again, this is not silver bullet, so this should also be in a larger context, and I'll talk more about that in limitations. But it really highlights the role that governments can play in enabling agroecology and a better nutrition without in a program that with one single intervention linked nutrition, rural development, education, and many things. So that's why I find it fascinating. And I think maybe I'll stop now.
Thank you very much, Vivian. So speaking of those famous limitations we've been talking about, I would like to talk to you, Myriam, about and speaking of policies, actually, what are the challenges actually that faces agroecological farmers or agroecological associations in Ecuador, and how can they better be supported through policies or maybe more on the organizational level?
So I agree with the group that presented before. When Gonzalo said we have very good policies, actually people were joking about the law of food sovereignty in Ecuador, because they say that that's a policy for export, not for local consumption, because we have the best policy probably written. It was a policy that learned a lot from zero hunger from Brazil, but it was very difficult to position. And I will say that the most important limitations right now are enabling those laws that already exist there. Yeah. So we have the Ley Orgánica del Régimen de Soberanía Alimentaria, which is talking about the regime, the food regime, and it was thought to change the food regime, which is completely different than food networks or food systems. It's talking about a whole different way of seeing the government around food, the whole government around food as the first the first need that they needed to fill. So it was a change not just of how farmers should produce or how we can just support farmers, but it was a change in the educational system, health system, financial system, so the university system, towards this different way of thinking about food as priority for the government. And that was how the Brazilian law was put together. Everything was about making food available in the best possible way for people, because for the Brazilian policy, the most important problem was that people were not, there were lots of inequalities. There were people who had food to throw away, and people who didn't have anything to eat in the daily ways. But they didn't think it was because it was a problem of production or consumption only, but it was a problem of the whole system of governance. So what these law, for instance, say for the main limitations that women like Maria have in Ecuador is that the local governments are responsible for food for the markets, making available the right infrastructures for selling, for instance. That way, Maria won't have to be awake at 2 a.m. to take all the tables, all the infrastructure that she has to build every time she has a feria in the city, for instance. She could sleep a little bit more than 2 or 3 hours a day when she has to sell, for instance. There should be water, current water. There should be all the services for, and it says that it should be especially for agroecological farmers. It says that in the law, in the policy that we have. But nothing like that has happened yet in Ecuador. There are not places that where the local government is providing that, for instance. So I think that's something that could happen more. The other thing is that if we're talking about education, our children learn in Ecuador, I don't know in other places of the world, the first song that they learn will be Los Pollitos Dicen, which means like Los Pollitos Dicen, it means that the hen, the mother of the small chicken should look for corn and wheat to eat. So that's the first thing our children learn. But actually, hens or chickens shouldn't be eating corn and wheat. They should be eating. They should be free, eating grass and eating worms, for instance. So we're learning about the food regime, a corporate food regime, since we're very little. And we learn about that. And then we also think about health as something that is also related to an institution or a clinic or a place where we go to treat our diseases. But actually, what we eat should be our main medicine. Yeah, so that's also related to the food sovereignty law in Ecuador, that we should be able to eat food that is the food that will give us health at the same time. So that is not happening because we have corporations that don't have any limits for their promotion of highly processed foods. So for Maria, it is very difficult to take away sugary drinks, salty foods, very bad fats in the highly processed foods that are very cheap in her town. Yeah. So when we made our research, we found that agroecological women are not eating more healthier than their neighbors because the children are the way these kinds of processed foods are entering the rural households, and it is very difficult even for agroecological families to take away those kinds of foods. And the rates of diabetes and hypertension are very similar to their neighbors who are not agroecological. So, which I mean with this is that we really have policies that could be put in, if they are put in place, we could be fighting for the corporate regime of food, and instead we could have a food sovereignty regime of food. There are lots of tools, political tools that we could enable, but we don't think we should be pressuring just farmers. I really think we, the people who eat, have to have more organizations, and I wish the people who push for the accomplishment of these policies will be the consumers. We, the ones who are here, we don't, probably many of us don't have a farm, but we could actually be making changes if we organize as consumers. So what I see is that farmers are already doing a lot of their part, but consumers are not doing much. So we don't think the consumer has always the reason. We say that in Ecuador, the consumer always has the reason because the consumer has the money. No, consumers can be not always right, and we really need to organize to have agroecology should be about consumption, a different way of consumption, and I think that's one of the weakest part of this network that we want to create. So if we don't have people asking for policies to be put in place, then it'll be very difficult to use those policies. We need consumers to get organized, so we all here can change the agriculture, even if we're not farmers.
Right, and thank you, Myriam. And maybe we will have a question period at the end, so maybe we can also explore this further. Anna, I mean, you talked about all the pathways that lead from agroecology to better health outcomes, but are there some limitations that we see that limit those pathways?
Right. So with all these structural issues that Myriam was talking about, you can imagine that it's a lot more difficult to sort of mobilize these really idealistic pathways that I was talking about earlier. And that's really what we've been seeing through our research in Ecuador. Now, at first, we had some reason to be quite happy about what we were finding when we were looking. We were comparing agroecological farmer women with other women in their communities who are also farmers, but who are not part of these agroecological processes. And in one province, we initially found a pretty reasonably sized difference in terms of dietary diversity. These agroecological farmers had better dietary diversity, which, a lot of you guys are in nutrition. What does that mean? It's a proxy for micronutrient sufficiency. When you're talking about an area with malnutrition, that's exciting. But in this same province, these same women who had this better dietary diversity, we're finding that they had the same or possibly more overweight and obesity than their quote unquote non-agroecological neighbors. And they had more diagnosis of diet-related chronic disease. So this was a little confusing. And then we did more research that I think Sabrina will be talking about later on. So we did more research in Ecuador in 2 other provinces with a lot more farmers. And we found that this was the same situation. Really, agroecological farmers were maybe doing a little better as far as dietary diversity, but as far as overweight and obesity, I think maybe if anything, they were maybe doing worse. And for diet-related chronic disease, where we actually did blood sampling at that point, and not just self-reported diagnoses. And we did blood sampling of a number of health indicators, glycolated hemoglobin and
lipid profile,
all those things. Bana is the expert here on that. We also did anemia,
iron, hemoglobin. Yeah,
though that's the same thing I said earlier, isn't it? Yeah, glucose. No.
So glycated hemoglobin and fasting glucose for diabetes proxies, and lipid profile and anemia.
Thank you. It's been a while. So what we were finding is that agroecological farmers were really not better off. And in some cases, it's possible that they're actually sort of worse off. So we're thinking, well, what's going on? I have a question for the audience. This is just a show of hands kind of a question. Who here has experience with quantitative research? Show of hands. Okay. Who here has an experience with qualitative research? Good. Who here has experience with mixed method research? Okay, so we're in a pretty good group of people here. And so the reason I ask you that is because now we're at this phase where we're really trying to understand what's going on, because given all those pathways I spoke about earlier about how we would expect agroecology to have, positive impacts across the board on nutrition, but that's not really what we're finding. Well, what's going on? And so here's the importance of listening to the farmers themselves and understanding their experience. And so the experience that Myriam told us about, if you're going to bed at midnight and then you're waking up at 2 a.m, you're working hard. When are you going to have time to sit down for a healthy meal, to prepare a healthy meal? There are these structural challenges that we need to also think about structural solutions for, so that these women aren't in the situation where they have to do that, or that so that these women don't have to then expend their energy putting up a tent and not even have a washroom to use in the area. But at the same time, it's also important to understand, how did these women get to the point where they are organizing around agroecology to begin with? We've also heard stories from women who've said, well, yeah, I had I was diagnosed with, diabetes, and I was seeing these problems I was having. And so that's what led me to the Agroecology Association, because I'm seeking a better life, a healthier life. So it's important to first understand the limitations of our own research, but also to go deeper and understand all of these different experiences, because we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Like, right now we're talking about limitations, but nothing is ever perfect. And there's this tendency to, as soon as something isn't perfect, we maybe abandon it. And I think we don't want to idealize it either. It's really important to recognize that it's real when we're finding that agroecological women are not doing better on these indicators of health. But then it's really important here, the research aspects, since most of us here work in research, I think, many of us do, to understand what it is we can do with our research and try to think of pragmatic ways to work both at the level of the family and the community, but also at the level of these structural issues.
Thank you very much, Anna. So speaking about things never being perfect, the Brazilian national school food program really has accomplished a lot of, it's a reference for a lot of us in public health and in different spheres of policy. But I have a question for you, Vivian, in terms of, we have heard that there hasn't been enough enforcement or maybe compliance, although it's a law in all areas in Brazil with the school food program. And can we also, so what are the challenges? What does prevent some schools from not adopting these policies? But also, can we rely on the one market to support, or one type of market, public procurement to support the small farmers?
Yes, thank you for the question. So maybe to understand the limitations, we need to understand why it was successful. And indeed, what I went to see was a successful case. I went to the south of Brazil, and many of the reasons why it was successful there, I would start, one is infrastructure, so good roads, access to vehicles, so farmers could go from their production side to the collection side. Governance was key, and the governance in the south of Brazil was, for me, was mind-blowing in terms of the amount of farmer organizations, the level of organization, the level of cooperation among organizations, the type of farmers organizations from production to processing. So the governance structure and organizational capacity was very, very high. Also, there was a large presence of agroecological farmers or small-scale farmers who knew how to produce vegetables and were ready to respond to this market and upscale their production because they had the knowledge, the type of production system. So there was actually the availability of those farmers to supply that demand. The other key component, along with that of governance, was the presence of NGOs and social movements. So the NGOs here played a very important role, kind of like filling in the gap of extension agents, because many times extension agents are not present, or when they are, they have a more traditional agronomic training. So sometimes in this case, they were ready to advise, commodity farmers or so on, but not necessarily agroecological farming. So some of the NGOs in this region took up that role to be kind of like the extension farmers of agroecology and allow these farmers to either transition, improve, and also gain certification. In this case, was a farmer-to-farmer certification so that they could access the premiums. So we have a variety of factors there that are not present everywhere. So not even in Brazil or other places. So in the northeast of Brazil and other places where the program was not as successful, you had much larger municipalities. So this program happened at the municipality scale, where the farmers of each municipality were delivering to feed the kids or the programs, the procurement programs of their municipality. In the south, sometimes they exceeded 30%, and sometimes farmers even provided for like neighboring municipalities. But in other regions where commodity farming, large-scale commodity farming was what dominated, it was really hard to find those small-scale farmers to meet that 30%, or because the municipalities were, like the size of the Netherlands in some cases, are huge compared to the south. Like just going from one place to another, just in terms of like the logistics and all that, it was very difficult. And again, like the social movements and organization was not necessarily there. So I've been in conversations, because after I saw this, I thought, like this is such a leverage point and so important. So after that, I wanted to work in other regions. So I went to Lima and I went to different places to talk to policymakers, civil society, and try to see what was going on. And I often spoke to people, for example, policymakers who said, oh, this would never work here because farmers are not organized. So no one wants to deal with like 300 small-scale farmers. They want to deal with one, right? So they want like a cooperative or things like that. And in many cases, that was not there. It was not functioning. So they wanted a reliable supply. And they said, oh, we'll never get a reliable supply here. Or the other one that was big, and I had never thought of that, was food safety. Many of these, in other places, they were really worried about food safety issues. So working directly with farmers, or how was the food going to be processed. So they preferred to just work with a third party who would handle the food, handle everything, and not have any sort of potential problems with the schools. So this idea of food safety, and were farmers able to provide products that met whatever food safety standards, that was also a big barrier. So to my disappointment, even though this was so successful and like such a clear, important point, it's been really, really hard to find many other successful stories. But I think it did create a model. And again, we don't want to like copy paste or replicate things, but an important model of how procurement and governments could create other markets and really support small-scale farmers, while at the same time like looking at nutrition and looking at agrobiodiversity. For example, some of the pilots I looked at in the Andes, there were 3 key concerns: malnutrition, anemia, agrobiodiversity, an area of very high agrobiodiversity that was being lost, because again, markets decide what's being cultivated, and there were not markets necessarily for the wide agrobiodiversity of things that are grown there. So more for certain crops. So they were worried about the erosion of agrobiodiversity, and they wanted to create markets that could rescue some of those crops and that were also nutritious. And there was also poverty. So it felt like a great fit. There were many pilots. This was a few years ago that I looked into this, a few pilots showing how it could work. But again, key limitations, farmers' organization, and in this case, also the concern with food safety. And maybe another note as a interesting positive outcome that came out of this, and what I saw in the south of Brazil and what it's possible, was also how it lifted the role of women. So in many of these systems, it's typically men who make decisions and so on. But because sometimes growing food is actually associated with women's knowledge and women's practices. And again, this is context specific and it may vary, but in many of the places in Latin America where I've looked into, it's mostly the women that tend to this, and sometimes it's just for household consumption. But when the markets appeared, it allowed them to take an economic role. So not just household, but actually to sell and start making money and start participating. So in this project, we also looked at women's empowerment. So that's another thing to discuss in terms of agroecology and like that gender dimension, and how markets can also not just empower agroecology, but also contribute to gender equity. But yeah, so those were some of the key limitations. And I mean, I think some of those can be worked, especially through organizations. So I feel like some of this infrastructure, like many of the concerns, an entry point, I think, is through organization and farmers' organization. I think that could be one that could then enable the other ones or take down the other barriers. But yeah, I'll stop now. Thank you.
Wow, what a rich discussion. So now we do have 15 more minutes to open up the discussion. If you have any questions or comments, I'll be passing the mic around. The hardest one.
To give the micro back to you. Thank you. I have a question for Pablo. Nice to meet everyone from Guatemala. I have a question for Ana. You were talking about pathways, and that made me think about lock-in effects. You know, the things that are sometimes structural, sometimes are very embedded into, you know, the households themselves. So I was wondering to what extent you've thought about lock-in effects on these pathways that you described. If there is any lesson learned from Ecuador or Guatemala already, you know, based on the work that we've been doing, if you can actually spot some of the things at both the structural national level, perhaps, and also about the way in which people actually think about food and how it is produced and what agroecology really means in terms of, you know, daily life. Thank you.
That's not something I've thought about in those terms. So it's something I'm glad, you're challenging me a little bit to look into new areas. But actually, one thing that I have a lot of discomfort with the way that I even discuss the subject about pathways, because humans don't operate on pathways. You know, we're not like this chemical reaction that is just happening with like inputs in, inputs out or something. Like this is a very like instrumentalist view of talking about food and about something that ultimately is a much more integrated, like food is, it's about your relationships. It's not something where you just think about, I'm going to optimize my nutrition. Well, maybe some people do, but most people don't. And so when you mention this lock-in effect or like the dynamics within households or within the greater social structure, if we were looking just at pathways and these really instrumentalist linkages, what happens when you block something? It makes it be that you can't keep going on the pathway. It's like if you block a tunnel, you can't get to the other side. But I think it's like maybe healthier to think of this maybe more like a river, where when you have something that presents you a challenge, maybe it's a gender dynamic or I don't know what that makes it be that you can't go through this pathway, a river will find another way, right? And so this is where we recognize the creativity. And I think what we're talking about this morning about existence and resistance and whatnot, the human creativity of when the sort of standard practice of how you're expected to achieve a result, when you can't because of these structural issues, when that doesn't work, you figure out a way around it. So I think I should give you an example, or else this all sounds very vague. I'm interested in the way that gender operates in agroecology, because you see these dynamics where women in some cultures, in some households, can't really like leave their homes without their husband's permission, or there are a lot of decisions that they're not really allowed to make on their own. And so, but then when they're doing something like participating in an agroecological market, even if there isn't a huge income, all of a sudden maybe there is some money that comes to the family, even if it's just a tiny amount. And so suddenly this is seen as a productive contribution to the household. So maybe you can't go and meet up with your women friends and just socialize and share freely on your own terms. But when you engage in something like an agroecological network, you find a way around these circumstances in order to go past this barrier that in this case might be the dynamic with the husband, right?
Thank you.
I think I didn't answer your question at all, but maybe you can answer my question later on.
I think we have a question here. Did you have a question? Okay, so Peter has a question.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Peter. Just a little question for Vivian. You said, at least I heard, that some countries spend up to 30% of their GDP on food.
So in general, up to 30% of a country's GDP can go into procurement of goods and services in general. So not just on food, but in general, products, services. So in general, if you procure things, whether it's textiles, energy, transportation, infrastructure, aligned with sustainability goals, you can create a market large enough that you can have a shift that you can, and in all sectors, but it's not up to 30% only in food. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Alok. It's a question for Vivian around markets. So I guess it's a two-part question, okay? The first is like, what's the role of the private sector in this dynamic? And what's the role of the international community as well in this dynamic around agroecological transitions in spreading the kind of Brazilian model? Be curious to hear about that.
So specifically in the Brazilian model?
The Brazilian type model, just, yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, international organizations like FAO have tried to bring this model to other places in Latin America, even to Africa under the name PAAA, Production for Africans, from Africans, or something like that, I think is the title. So there's being efforts from the international communities, but also this model of procurement has also been taken by or inspired private sector actions, because also big private companies like Nestle, Unilever, Walmart, and so they also create large markets. So they also have the capacity, and some of them are exploring that. Some of them have their own sustainability criteria and so on. So before, we used to rely a lot more on third-party certification schemes. Nowadays, those large-scale multinationals operate with their own, in many cases, sustainability criteria. And they have also the capacity to generate their own markets and therefore support these farmers. And some are kind of doing it, or at least trying to do it. I have not looked into detail on that, but I know there's more pressure for them to be responsible, and there's a lot more eyes on who they procure from, under what conditions, who are they supporting. So they've had to increase the transparency in their value chains, and this has led to, ideally, hopefully, better conditions for some farmers. So that is the role where the private sector can play. And as Myriam was saying, as consumers in general, by, again, requesting transparency and wanting to know who produced our food, under what conditions, we can create more pressure so that this type of private sector companies and transactions work on their transparency and on revealing the farmers behind. So it's not as it was decades ago that we knew nothing about where our food came and we did not care. No one was asking many of these questions before, but because more people are asking them, therefore those pressures are passed down. And now there's, talks about technologies, blockchain, and how can you guarantee transparency and so on. So it does have an impact, and it's similar to the Brazilian model. So institutional procurement, large scale companies procurement, and so on. So
perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? Maybe someone can tell me what time
Bana?
it is. Yes.
Bana. Even though for this example of Maria, she's really tired and she's not doing very well on her health. But if you ask Maria if she will stop going to the agroecological markets, she will say, no, I want to continue. And if you ask why, she will say, because this is the way I can get out of the house. I can meet my friends who are actually family. I can exchange food in that market, even if I don't sell enough. And this has been a way to have other friends to talk about the common problems we women have in our community. So I don't want to change that. So I think it is really important that we ask them, as we have tried to do when we have been giving back the results of the research, not as a table of data, but we went to do a soup with the women and talk about all the food, how we can better remember how our grandmothers used to cook in a better way, for instance, not with too much fats, not with too much salt, not with too much, or maybe without sugar. And we have been talking about that. So I think asking women themselves the agroecological women, what they need, what they want to do, and talking with them about finding ways how to rest more, how to take care of themselves a little bit more. I think it's important to ask the people who we think maybe they don't want to be agroecological anymore. No, they want to, because they have found lots of benefits for their lives in this pathway. So I think as our work probably is not giving answers, but asking the women what do they think are the answers for them in their situation and in their context. So they usually are, they have some ideas about how to do and how to do better, even with markets. They always think about having consumers that know better what the agroecology means, and also doing lots of things that they can do to not be sick, for instance. So I think it is really important that maybe we don't we don't have all the answers as researchers, and that we kind of ask the people what they need and how we can support the improvement of their lives, because it's not that we're ending up agroecology right now. Women want to continue. That's a good news.
So we have about maybe 2 minutes left. We can take a quick question.
Merci beaucoup pour les présentations. Encore une fois, je précise que je viens d'Haïti. Ce que je veux dire par là, parce que je peux dire, au niveau des pays comme Haïti à faible revenu, les populations ont toujours voulu consommer local. OK? C'est pas comme si on vient leur apprendre qu'ils doivent consommer local. Bon, c'est plutôt maintenant en termes d'équilibre alimentaire, surtout par rapport aux enfants, tout ça, comment faire ces équilibres-là. Mais les gens veulent manger local. Mais parallèlement, avec tout ce qu'il y a comme politique d'ouverture, comme ça, et puis on reçoit beaucoup de produits de l'extérieur, mais des fois, les gens, ils veulent, mais ce sont les politiques, en fait, qui n'arrivent pas à gérer. Donc, je ne sais pas de quelle manière maintenant on va pouvoir mener ces combats, parce que les gens, ils veulent, mais les autorités en tant que telles, les différents pays, on bombarde, c'est le dumping, et puis maintenant, les gens se battent contre ça, mais les personnes en charge ne le font pas. Merci.
I can translate that question. So she was repeating that she's from Haiti, and in a low-income country like Haiti, they do want to eat local, but at the same time, I mean, there are with all the liberalization policies, they have opened the markets to things like dumping, where people now do want to eat local, but it has become much harder to eat local. So how can we fight this fight?
can very quickly say something that I think also links to Anna's previous question. And what I start to see is that there are two parallel diets that are going on in many of these communities. And one diet is the traditional diet that still has the traditional products, traditional customs. And then another diet that is all the industrialized products, all the Coca-Cola and everything that comes from abroad or wherever. And those two happen at the same household, same person. And the industrialized diet obviously negates the possible benefits of an agroecological diet. But I agree with you, there's a lack of coherence in policies. And some policies are promoting agroecology or trying to, or talk about sustainability. Others are about nutrition, but others are about open trade and let's get all those things there. So yeah, there is definitely an incoherence in how we're approaching the linkages between nutrition, production, trade, consumption. And way forward, there's something called policy coherence for sustainable development, one way to try to create more coherence about those things. I don't know.
Thank you all very much for this, and especially the panelists for this really rich discussion that I think opened more doors and reflection than it answered questions. But thank you. This was very enriching, and I hope you go with a lot of inspiration.